Okay, this is chapter number 16, Development of Organism and Continuity of Life. We were doing sexual reproduction in plants. In our last lesson, we talked about self-pollination, while today we have to read about cross-pollination, its advantages and disadvantages. Then we will see the flower features favoring cross-pollination. Then we will see what is wind and insect pollination and the characters of flowers that are favoring pollination by wind or favoring pollination by insect. Let's see what cross pollination is. Cross pollination is quite simple, where the pollen from one from one anther of one plant flower would be transferred to the stigma of the flower of the second plant. So here you see, in contrast to self-pollination, the plants are two. There would be different plants carrying different kind of flowers. By kind of flowers means the reproductive organs. One might be carrying the female reproductive organ while the other would be carrying the male reproductive organ. On the other hand, bisexual flowers can also undergo cross-pollination when the stigma and anther mature at different times. For instance, if I have taken this flower of plant 1, you can see that the pollen is taken from the anther of this flower and is transferred to the stigma of this flower. So the plants are different. Maybe the flower of plant 1 does not have a mature stigma. So the male and female reproductive organs may mature at different times. So the pollen is to be carried from the flower of plant 1 to the stigma of the flower of plant 2. This is cross-pollination. What are the advantages of cross-pollination? Offsprings may have inherited beneficial qualities from both parents. Abundant and more viable seeds tends to be produced. Seeds are capable of surviving longer before germination. More varieties of offsprings can be produced. It means that we can see greater genetic variation, which is very unlike in self-pollination where there was very little variation. Increased chance of survival of species to change in the environment. The changing environment may not affect the flowers or the plant that are undergoing cross-pollination because of genetic variation. What is the disadvantages? Here two parents are required and an external factor is always required. A pollinator is always required. It may be insect or wind, which would carry the pollen from one flower of one plant to the stigma of the other flower of the other plant. More energy and pollen is wasted as compared to self-pollination. Adaptations of plants to favor cross-pollination. It means that what are those characters in a flower that would favor cross-pollination. Dioecious plants bear either male or female flowers, so that self-pollination is impossible. I told you about dioecious plants. These are the plants that bear one kind of flower. Either they would be having male reproductive organs or they would be having female reproductive organs. So you see, self-pollination is impossible in such plants. Maturation of anthers and stigmas at different times. So in case of bisexual flowers, self-pollination is prevented in a way that the anthers and stigma of the bisexual flowers would mature at different times. Stigma of bisexual flowers may be situated a distance away from the anthers, so there would be less chances of self-pollination. So these are the three ways by which flowers can favor cross-pollination and prevent self-pollination. This is the summary of telling you what self-pollination and cross-pollination is. You can see here that I have drawn two flowers of the same plant. Here pollen from the anther of the same flower can drop on the stigma of the same flower. This is self-pollination. And it is also self-pollination when the pollen of this anther of this flower would go onto the stigma of the same flower on the same plant, right? On the other hand, the cross-pollination is happening between the flowers of two different plants. If you can see, the plants are different. By different, I means the number, not the species. The species is same, but the plant or the place where they are being placed is different. So let's see the pollination by wind and insects. As the name is indicating, pollination by wind means the dispersal of pollens because of wind, while the pollination or transfer of pollens by insect and bird would be called as insect pollination. What are the characters of those flowers which facilitate wind or insect pollination? We have to see what are the characters of those flowers, what would be the features of those flowers that would lead to wind pollination and that would lead to insect pollination. Here in the table, I have summarized the differences. Let's discuss features of pollen grains in insects and wind pollinated flowers. Pollen grains would be larger in those flowers which are pollinated by insect, while they would be smaller in size when they have to be pollinated or dispersed by wind. The difference is obvious. The smaller the size of the pollen, more easier it is for the wind to carry them away from the parent plant. Size larger, the texture would be, the texture of the pollen would be sticky and rough so that it can cling to the body of the insect and is carried away. While in the case of wind pollinated flower, the texture of the pollen grains would be dry and smooth. The weight of the pollens which are to be dispersed by insect would be relatively heavier than the ones dispersed by the wind. The quantity of the pollen grains dispersed by insects would be smaller compared to those which are dispersed by the wind. What about anthers? Anthers in the case of flowers which are pollinizing by insect would be inside the flower, while those that are dispersed by wind will have their anthers hanging outside and will be relatively larger. What about the stigma? The smaller surface area would be seen in those flowers which are pollinated by insect, while the stigmas of the flowers which are pollinated by wind would have a larger surface area. The size, color and petals of the insects which are pollinated by insect would be large and colorful. It is to attract the insect or bird towards it so that they can have pollens in their body, or the pollens may cling to their body and is dispersed away. On the other hand, the petals of the wind pollinated flower would be small and drab or would be dull colored. Scent and nectar guides would be present in the insect pollinated flower, while they would be absent in wind pollinated flowers. Nectary, or the glands which produce nectar, which would be present in insect pollinated flower. On the other hand, they would be absent in those flowers which are pollinated by wind, because of the fact that here no attraction is required to invite the insect or the birds to come over them and get the pollens, because they are dispersing their pollens through wind. The examples of the respective flowers which are pollinated by insect and wind are given here, and I have summarized all the features of insect pollinated flower and wind pollinated flower with their examples.